Okay, so where we picked up from last class was at the end of digestion in the stomach. So we talked about how during digestion, um, these two sphincters at the beginning and end of the stomach are closed. And then once digestion is pretty much complete, what you have in the stomach is this really acidic and full of nutrient kind of broth or soup in the stomach, which is called chyme. And then this pyloric sphincter starts to relax and open up a little bit, and then let the chyme flow into the small intestine. So, so the very first part of the small intestine is the duodenum or duodenum, and if we look at the function of the small intestine as a whole, it has two main functions. So um, all of the digestion that was started in the mouth and the stomach will be completed. And then, as well, once these have been broken down into their smallest components, they can be absorbed through the lining of the small intestine as well. So at this very first spot in the duodenum, we basically we have to immediately neutralize the acid of the chyme, and then we'll continue the digestion and absorption of the parts of food. So in this very first part, we have secretions from the liver, um, and we'll talk about bile in a second. And so basically, in between meals, the liver stores bile in the gallbladder, and then when it's needed, it's secreted into the duodenum. And then the other main organ is your pancreas, and the pancreas secretes this pancreatic juice, and we'll talk about in a second what's involved there. Um, so the purpose of bile, and this main component being these bile salts, is to emulsify fats. And basically, if you think about what fat would look like in a liquid, it's hydrophobic, and so it would all stick together into this huge ball. Your stomach, through mechanical digestion, breaks up all this fat into these little tiny droplets. But if you think about little tiny droplets of fat in water, pretty quickly these will reassociate again and then make a huge droplet. But if we want to digest the fats and break them up, digest the triglycerides, we have to keep these little drops apart so that other enzymes can get in to degrade them. So bile salts, they basically have a hydrophobic part and a hydrophilic part. And so they stick to the fat droplets and they keep them separate. So it keeps them emulsified, which just means basically tiny droplets of fat or tiny droplets of lipids in water, so that other enzymes can get in. So then in both bile and pancreatic juice, we have components that can take care of the acid from the chyme. So mainly this is bicarbonate, which is a really common buffer in your body. And that actually is present in both of these, even though your book doesn't really talk about the bicarbonate in bile. So the other thing in the pancreas, so you have a lot of digestive enzymes coming in, and we'll give some specific names, but they're digesting, carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and fats. And then additionally, so besides all the enzymes coming in here, there are some enzymes that are actually secreted from the walls of the small intestines. So we'll take a look at some of these enzymes. So I know it seems like a lot here, but what you'll start to see is that a lot of the names of the enzymes will give you a clue as to what they're actually doing and can work in the other direction as well. So think about small intestine has all these enzymes, but before food gets there, it has started digesting two molecules. So if you can take a second to remember, in the mouth, you have this amylase, salivary amylase, which starts to break down carbohydrates. And in the stomach, You should know this by now. You have pepsin, which starts to break down proteins. So if you think about the four main types of macromolecules, if they're broken down into their smallest component, these are the molecules that can actually be absorbed because they're small enough they need to be able to come through maybe a protein channel or directly through the membrane. So carbohydrates will be broken down into monosaccharides. And so this intermediate molecule is, well, if you look here, so okay, maltase, sucrase, lactase probably gives you an idea that the intermediate molecules are disaccharides. So amylase breaks these into, these kind of two sugar components, and then these specific enzymes break them into the individual monosaccharides. So proteins, their smallest component is, or are, amino acids. And so, you have a peptidase that breaks these individual amino acids off. And so in between a protein and an amino acid would be just smaller polypeptides. And so these enzymes, trypsin and chymotrypsin, they're just making these smaller chains so that you can have enzymes that can get in and break off the amino acids more easily, these enzymes being peptidases. So nucleic acids are broken into nucleotides, and even though this is the monomer, so also this enzyme name, hopefully easy to remember, nuclease, but then nucleotides can be broken down even further. So the names of the enzymes here aren't important, but you've got a sugar, a phosphate, and base, the components of nucleotides. And then fats, I would just kind of have in mind that bile salts are actually not an enzyme. So they're just stabilizing the fat droplets. So keep in mind that's an exception to this column of the first enzyme. But then, fats in the end can be broken down. Triglycerides will be 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol. So lipase, think of lipid, and then bile salts just stabilize these fat droplets in water. So coming from here, we've got the smallest components. These are the things that can actually be absorbed through the lining of the small intestine. So if we were going to draw out, in the small intestine, it's kind of worth mentioning too, when we say small intestine, I actually think the Turkish word describes this better. So ince bağırsak, if I pronounce that correctly. The reason it's small is that it's thin. It's actually quite long, so it's something like 6 meters. But then in here, even though it's thin, it will have these folds in the wall, and whoops. Whoa. All right, sorry about that. So you have these folds. On each of these folds, you have these villi, and so that's what you're looking at here. And then even in the villi, if you looked at these specific cells on the top here, they would also have these tiny, what are called microvilli. And so this accidentally came up. But the whole point of all of these folds, so the folds, the villi, the microvilli, is to maximize the surface area. And the more surface you have, the more surface over which molecules can be absorbed. So this is something that you see a lot of places in biology. So then if you think of nutrients coming into the cells, we know, hopefully you have an idea from, what is that, chapter 5, that they can diffuse into cells. So this includes facilitated diffusion and transport proteins. And then depending on concentrations, there are many different active transport methods of getting them inside. Endocytosis is also a transport mechanism, although in adults, not as much as diffusion and active transport. So then if we look at coming in and being transported into the body, they come in through these cells, and then for basically proteins and sugars, they will be absorbed and go into the blood vessels. So these are the blood vessels. They'll kind of go down and then go into veins. And then the fatty acids and glycerol, once they're absorbed, they recombine into fats. They're coated with proteins that can dissolve in blood. And then instead of going into the bloodstream, can dissolve in liquid, they go into kind of these channels down the middle are carrying lymph. So these will eventually get into the blood, but immediately go to the lymph vessels. We'll talk about those later. So this is kind of important. Immediately after these compounds are absorbed into the blood, instead of going to the heart and getting pumped out everywhere in the body, they first go to the liver. So you've got all these blood vessels from the small intestines, all these veins, and then they all flow into this one hepatic portal vein. And so this is carrying blood back to the heart, but first it goes through the liver basically to be filtered. So we've talked about a couple different functions of the liver in terms of storing glucose, and we recently talked about production of bile. But in this capacity, blood going away from the small intestine back to the heart first flows through the liver to be filtered. So the liver is really good at transforming certain compounds into other ones. And so, for example, when your body processes alcohol, it's absorbed, goes through the liver. Your liver modifies alcohol into less toxic substances for your body. So it's kind of your first line of filtering out toxins and things like medications. Then it also transforms some of these molecules into, proteins, blood clotting proteins, lipoproteins, transport fats and cholesterol. So your liver does a ton of different things, but I would think of it mostly as filtering the blood on its way back to the heart. All right, and then last, so your large intestine, it's not very long, but it's wider in diameter. And the main thing here is reabsorbing water. So all the water that's in your digestive tract, some of it gets absorbed in the small intestine, and then your large intestine really is continuing to absorb water, and then a few vitamins as well, which your book talks about being produced in the appendix. So, there's bacteria in here that produce some of these vitamins. They're not really crucial to functioning and often prone to infection, which is why some people end up having their appendix removed. So coming in from the small intestine, this first part is your cecum, and then water gets reabsorbed, and then feces are stored in your rectum before being expelled out through your anus. And so if you look at water being reclaimed, so if you have diarrhea, really runny feces, so this would result when you have too little water reclaimed. So there's too much water in the stool. And then if you have too much water that is absorbed out of the small intestine, you end up being constipated, so really firm stool. Okay, so that's about it. And